Unitarian Universalist, not only affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person, we also affirm the inherent wholeness of every being, despite apparent brokenness. No one reading these words is a stranger to pain or the knowledge that things break or break down. Promises, friendship, sobriety, hope, communication. This breaking happens because our human hearts and our very institutions are frail and imperfect. We make mistakes. Life is messy. Brokenness happens. We're intimately acquainted with brokenness then, even as we believe that no matter how fractured we are or once were, we can make whole people of ourselves. We are whole at our core because of the great, unnameable, sometimes inconceivable love in which we live. As UUs, we believe that paying attention to something is an act of love. Witnessing and naming brokenness is how we begin to heal it. Some sorrows demand to be named out loud. My sister died. My body is fragile. I'm scared that I won't be able to pay my rent this month. The streets in my city are filled with violence. Healing begins when we examine what's in pain, wonder how it occurred, and allow it to teach us. In fact, sometimes the brokenness is immense, and the only grasp, the only power we have over that large and complicated pain looming over us is to bear witness, to tell its story, and to seek out companions and helpers who are willing to agree that yes, there is something breaking or messy in front of us, and we will not leave or even look away until the repair has begun. If love begins with attention, repair takes the form of compassion, bearing witness, speaking out. Repair looks like connection, justice, or even revolution. It looks like after-school tutoring programs, community meals, and holding signs in front of the City Hall. And it begins by placing full trust and faith that there is inherent wholeness in every broken situation.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I want to start by apologizing to Suzanne, who thought that there was a plate full of cinnamon-covered donuts. They're potatoes. So there's a story I've seen posted on social media here and there, and in it, a young adult is complaining to a grandparent about their struggles, and they ask, how did you do it? How did you get through everything you've gone through? And the wise and loving grandparent grabs 3 pots and they start boiling water. They put potatoes in one pot, eggs in another, and then coffee beans in the third. And once the cooking is done, Grandma or Grandpa says, you see, hardship is like this boiling water. You can let it make you soft and weak and mushy like the potatoes. You can let it make you hard and tough and inflexible like the eggs. Or you can be like the coffee and work with the boiling water to create something flavorful and wonderful and something that's better than the 2 things could be by themselves. Obviously, I have some thoughts on this metaphor. First, this grandparent in this totally real, sure it happened, completely relatable story has great intentions. But they seriously overcooked those eggs and potatoes. Probably because if you want to make coffee by boiling whole beans, it's going to take at least an hour. If I were giving a Yelp review to this kitchen, they would definitely lose some stars. I'd say, great ambiance, good conversation, but the potatoes were mushy and the eggs were rubbery. And don't even get me started on how long I had to wait for my coffee. Secondly, people are not food. Can you say that with me? People are not food. So object lessons that compare people to food will always be flawed on some level. But what I really don't love about this inspirational story is the idea that there's a right or wrong way to experience hardship or trauma. That we have a choice in how it affects us, our minds and our bodies, and that if we come out of trauma without a what doesn't kill me makes me stronger mentality, that somehow we're not a very good survivor. Are you an egg? Are you a potato? Are you the coffee? Are you all three? Should it matter? Spoiler alert, it should not. I'm here today to talk about how we as a UU community can become a trauma-informed congregation. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Human Services suggests that trauma-informed communities practice the 4 R's. A program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma, responds by fully integrating that knowledge into their practices and policies and procedures, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization of the people they interact with and the people that are part of their community. So how do we do this? Let's start with realizing the impact of trauma. As many as 70% of adults in the United States have experienced some kind of traumatic event in their lifetime. Over 90% of clients in public mental health settings report having experienced trauma. I don't need a show of hands, but what percentage of people in this room have experienced trauma? We can't know for sure unless someone wants us to know, but I think it's safe to say that number is significant. Trauma is not just an individual problem, it is a community problem. Trauma impacts families, sometimes being passed down from generation to generation. We call it generational trauma. It overwhelms public services and increases risks to public health. Our war on drugs has been a failed war on the traumatized. Our prisons, jails, and drug rehabilitation centers are filled with the traumatized. But so are our schools, so are our grocery stores, so are our churches. In other words, trauma touches all of us, whether you've been through trauma or not. So now that we know a little more about the impact, our next step is to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. So what is trauma? The National Council describes it this way. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by events or circumstances and responds with intense fear, horror, or helplessness. Extreme stress overwhelms the person's capacity to cope. So most of us have heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And while this brings up images of war or soldiers, PTSD can occur from any kind of trauma. Sufferers of PTSD experience repeated and unwanted memories of their traumatic events. Some theories put forth the idea that traumatic memories actually stay in the wrong place in our brains. They stay in the short-term memory centers. They never make it back to long-term memory. So when someone is reminded of their trauma, even in the slightest way, those memories come racing back, and they are experiencing that trauma again as if it's happening right now. Not just a sad, hard memory, but trauma all over again. Other trauma symptoms include nightmares, flashbacks, excessive or inappropriate guilt or self-blame, low self-concept, a feeling of always being on guard, or being easily startled, avoiding anything that might remind us of the trauma, and sometimes shutting down emotionally or going numb. In more severe cases, dissociation occurs. So people will describe times where they feel like they're walking outside of their body, or they're walking in a dream-like state. This can be very scary for someone. Now, not every person who's been through a traumatic event will develop PTSD, but trauma has a strong impact on the person. To understand this better, I'd like to show you a bit about the human brain. So, this is your brain. It's not, this is my hand. David, I almost got you there. But I'm going to use my hand to help you understand your brains, particularly how our brains manage emotions, thoughts, and decision-making in stressful situations. So feel free to follow along with your own brains, but really I mean your hands. Well, you can use your brains too. Probably need to, but all right. So right here on the heel of the hand, we have the brain stem. This is in charge of all of the automatic things that go on in your body. It keeps you breathing, keeps your heart beating, digestion, all of that stuff. It's not really involved in decision-making or emotions. But it can be impacted by trauma. Anybody who's been super stressed out, well, your heart starts beating a lot faster. Your breathing becomes shallow, or you might struggle to breathe. Gastrointestinal problems can occur in times of stress. So this works really hard, but it can be overridden a little bit. The next thing we want to talk about is in the limbic system, the amygdala. I love that word, amygdala. So the amygdala is all about emotion. Okay, this is our instinctive, reactive center of our brain. Quick decisions, it's protective. Okay, this developed because we needed to stay safe from saber-toothed tigers. And the good news is we're all here, so we do. But it still works the same way, even though there aren't saber-toothed tigers today. It doesn't know that. It just knows, hey, it worked. I've been passed on to generation after generation, so I'd better stay here. All right, 2-year-olds and certain politicians, this is where they're at. All right? Okay. I don't know who I'm talking about. Now, there's not a lot of deep thinking here, but when we perceive a threat to our safety, this part of the brain activates. And we have a few options for what to do. So fight, flight, and freeze are the automatic reactions, and it's a good thing they're there. Okay? They do keep us safe when they're needed. There is a fourth reaction that can occur when we perceive a threat. This is the fourth F, or fawn. So this is not an automatic response like the first three. This is something that develops. Somebody who's been through a lot of abuse may learn that if they fawn over or take very good care of their abuser, that they can maybe avoid some of those abusive outbursts. So fawning can then infiltrate the rest of their lives, where they take really good care of all those around them because all of those around them, according to their amygdala, are a threat. So they've got to do that job they learned to do. The last part of the brain we want to look at is the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobe, right here. All right, this is the last to develop, and if you're under the age of 24 or 25, my daughter there, it's still cooking. Give it some time. Maybe take advice from your mom. Eat it. I love you. So this is the part of the brain that's in charge of logic, rational thinking, decision-making, good decision-making, judgment, impulse control. All right? It can help you stop, breathe, and think before you do something that you regret. So, yay, frontal lobes, right? They obviously work all the time because we never get overwhelmed or lose our cool or do less than healthy things, right? What? Even if we're over 24 or 25? So what happens then? When our minds and bodies feel threatened, become flooded with emotions or stress hormones, we flip our lid. And guess who's in charge? The amygdala becomes in charge, and this is pretty much offline. Our ability to think clearly, be rational, make those decisions is compromised while we are up there in that stress. So, have you ever tried to reason with someone who was overwhelmed with emotion and try to explain to them why what they were saying was not rational? How did that work for you? Yeah, it probably didn't. So, what a dirty trick for nature to play, right? Except this phenomenon is the reason humans have survived. Imagine seeing a saber-toothed tiger in the bushes and trying to solve that problem with your frontal lobe. I think I'll make a pros and cons list of what I should do about the saber-toothed tiger. Maybe I'll run, maybe I'll, before you're done with the sentence, you're eaten, okay? So we need this to protect us from harm. The problem for the trauma survivor is that trauma has taught the brain that danger is everywhere. And so this gets activated too often and too severely. So if you're with someone who is flooded or triggered, or if this is happening to you, coping tools that can calm the emotional response and allow the frontal lobe to come back online are going to be very important. In the pews, you'll find my favorite list of 84 safe coping tools to use anytime you need them. When I am in the public, representing my company at, say, the Free Community Meal or Pride Parade or at whatever, I tell my bosses, my secondary role here is to promote this business and advertise. But I am there to pass out those coping tool sheets. That is my job. And if you guys get more business, okay. But I need anyone who's never going to walk in our doors to have a copy of this list. So knowing this about trauma response means understanding that a certain percentage of the population are in some form of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, maybe several times a day. This can happen in subtle or more obvious ways. Traumatized people respond to and learn to manage these triggers often by becoming bigger or smaller. So those who become bigger are the fighters and those who flee. They keep themselves safe and distant from others by being loud and boisterous and angry, or maybe overly talkative or overly funny and inappropriate sometimes. Sometimes they become literally bigger, gaining weight to create a buffer between them and their triggers. I enjoy saying to my clients, you don't get a body like this without some trauma, guys. You know, I cope at McDonald's. So, people who freeze and fawn are attempting to become smaller. If I get smaller, maybe no one will see me. If no one can see me, no one can hurt me. If I take good care of everyone all the time, I can fly under the radar. If I shut down and don't feel, I'll keep surviving. If I can make my body smaller, I can feel in control. So have you experienced people like this? Maybe you've heard the trauma survivor who gets bigger described like with words like obnoxious, over the top, dramatic, psycho. Maybe you've heard the trauma survivor who gets smaller described as shy or awkward, a pleaser, a doormat. As we begin to recognize the trauma survivors around us, we move into the last of our R's. How do we respond and resist re-traumatizing any trauma survivors in our lives, and particularly here in the UUCO congregation? Being trauma-informed means knowing that the behaviors that are jarring or strange or hard may be a trauma response for the person you're interacting with. Being trauma-informed means that knowing that we all have an obligation to be understanding, to move away from the question, what's wrong with them, and toward the question, what happened to them? Being trauma-informed means truly accepting that trauma changes people, sometimes for life, and that those people had little control over how they were able to survive, but they survived. Being trauma-informed means knowing that with intervention and help, a trauma survivor can improve and overcome many of the effects of trauma. And that doesn't have to mean going to therapy, though I'm obviously a big fan of therapy. Being trauma-informed means being a part of that help, that intervention, rather than being just another source of trauma. So doing this means creating a community here at UUCO that is aligned with the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. These principles are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice, and choice, and the understanding of cultural, historical, and gender issues that may play into trauma. Now, I don't know about you, but those sound a lot like UU7 principles. Yeah? Okay. So when we live the principle of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, we create safety. Creating safety also means understanding what safety means to those in our congregation. Do we ask before we touch someone? Do we provide a warning when our discussion includes details of topics that can trigger trauma survivors? Do we get to know each other well enough to know each other's safety needs? Living the principles related to justice means we are open and transparent about the way decisions are made and the way our offerings are spent. It means being willing to communicate openly and share our concerns, even when it's awkward and hard. It means more often than not taking our concerns directly to the person involved rather than involving others first. Respect for the interconnected web of all existence creates the peer support necessary for a trauma-informed community. We find this in our pastoral care team, in our book clubs and get-togethers and fellowship hours. No one gets through life alone, and no one should have to. So let's keep checking in. The right of conscience and the use of democratic process meet the trauma-informed need for collaboration and mutuality. This means promoting servant leadership and avoiding rigid top-down systems. If it affects you, you should have the right to vote on it. The trauma-informed principle of empowerment, choice, and voice can be found in the UU principle of the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The recurrent and overarching emotion of trauma is powerlessness. Allowing all members of our congregation to choose their own spiritual paths at their own pace and in their own way empowers congregants and encourages them to return. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations and the goal of world community necessitate an ongoing search for understanding of the cultural, historical, and gender issues that might make our congregation safe or unsafe for potential members. Are we aware of our privilege? Are we working to identify and challenge our biases? Are we practicing true allyship with marginalized communities by listening and amplifying their voices more than our own? On a personal note, as mentioned in the introduction, I am a trauma survivor. When I write about trauma on Facebook, I often sign off as your friendly neighborhood therapist with PTSD. My traumas began young, and I experienced repeated traumas throughout my adult life, which gives me the fun designation of someone with complex trauma. For a while in my life, I truly feel that I was made stronger by the things I went through, and it is absolutely a fact that for some, post-traumatic growth can occur after trauma. But the effects of long-term and repeated trauma have kind of put me past that. I am altered. While I'm strong, and I've worked hard in my own therapy to overcome as much of the impact of PTSD as I can, I still experience triggers. I still become flooded. I freeze or I fight. I go numb. And I cope. I use the tools I've learned and I come back from it. I work hard to challenge the shame and blame thoughts and ask myself, is that your trauma talking, Sarah? I remind myself of a favorite mantra, something I blurted out after a particularly healing session with my therapist. I'll never be the same, and that's okay. I often think about how the majority of that therapy was done while I was a new member of this congregation. I absolutely believe the UU principles were a support and help during that process. Are you an egg? Are you a potato? Are you the coffee? I hope you're all aware by now that the question is flawed from the start. The egg is still an egg. The potato is still a potato. The coffee beans are now coffee, and all of them have value and worth. If you've been through trauma, no matter how you survived it, no matter where it has taken you, you are a survivor. You're welcome here and you're needed here. And I believe we can all commit to creating a space where you will thrive. When that storm comes, don't run for cover. When that rain falls, let it wash away. When those lights flash, then you'll hear the thunder roar. When the love calls, will you open the door? Thank you.